You're here for Season 7 of the Whole Horse Podcast, now at 110 episodes and counting. I'm your host, Alexa Linton, coming to you from Vancouver Island in Canada. I can't wait to continue to share thought-provoking, edge-pushing, geeky, and often challenging conversations with horse professionals from all areas of our industry who are working to make horses' lives better. This season, you can look forward to deep dives into equine bodywork and cranial work with my friend and colleague, Elise Miki, and much more on the specifics of creating enriching, healthy horse spaces, an area I'm particularly passionate about. I'm so excited that you're here listening in, meeting great horsey humans, and hopefully learning a new thing or two about horses and yourself. Let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. You're here for the Whole Horse Podcast, and it's Alexa Linton. And I'm here today with someone I just so excitedly tracked down. I've been on a mission lately to learn about equine environments and spaces and how to make our equine spaces work for our horses and for the environment around them. And I discovered this amazing website called Equiculture. And then I discovered Jane Myers, who's here with me today. So thank you for being here, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Very excited to be here.
Well, ditto. We were just having a chat beforehand, and I realized how very passionate I am about this subject and how also new even I am to these ways of thinking about keeping horses. So I would love to share or just ask you to start, Jane, how you came to this awareness about horses, horse environments, horse keeping, and like what that journey looked like for you up until this point.
Okay, so basically I'm quite old now. So when I was a lot younger, I did a master's degree in equine science and I specialised in the grazing behaviour of horses, but I had no idea it would lead me to where I am now. And so that was quite a few years ago, nearly 40 years ago. And from that, then straight after doing that, my husband and I emigrated to Australia, and we just assumed that people would know how to look after their land and keep horses a certain way and all that sort of thing. But we saw all sorts of things over there that, as well as, here's not perfect either here in the UK, but we saw things and realised that a lot of horse owners actually don't know anything about managing land and so on. When you think about it, a lot of horses people move to owning land, but they don't have that land management background. So we started off teaching that, and then over the years that evolved into looking after the environment, and in order that it can then look after the horses, we started looking at it from that angle, because traditionally when you look at how people look after the land, they don't tend to think of it in that order. They think of the horses first, which you might think makes sense, and the land is second. But in fact, if you think of it that way round, the land usually then ends up on a downward spiral, and then it ends up not being good for the horses. So we turned all that on its head over the years, and we developed a system of management, which actually, because I know quite a lot about equine behaviour and how they behave in the wild, we developed a system that actually allows them to live as near as possible in a domestic situation to how they would live in the wild situation. Obviously, there's going to be a few compromises, but it's very, very close by keeping in, looking at how they would behave naturally. And that in turn helps to look after the land. It actually regenerates the land. And it's just a win-win all round, because the horses then end up healthier and happier. Yourself as a horse owner, you end up spending less money, usually less time and so on, because a lot of the systems we have for horse keeping, believe it or not, originated in the military. So they're all actually about wasting time, because they're about having one recruit and one horse, spending hours and hours doing all these ritualized things with horses, which are just a total waste of time, a lot of it. And that's what our systems, modern systems, have evolved from, which doesn't make sense. So we've turned all that on its head, and we now have this system, as I say, which is easier all round and takes care of the environment at the same time. And because of that, then we get government backing, because we're now teaching people how their horses can actually be a tool for change. They can actually improve the environment. Here in the UK and Europe, we talk about rewilding quite a lot, where the horses are actually rewilding or regenerating the landscape, and they're actually used in these projects, and it's absolutely fascinating. It just blows your socks off, honestly. The more you learn about it, the more exciting it gets. So even though the subject of pasture management, if we say, oh, we're doing a talk about pasture management, it's really hard to get people there. But once they're there, they are absolutely blown away because this subject is amazing.
Oh, oh my goodness. I have so many. So as I shared before, I live on Vancouver Island in Canada, in North America. We have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like you said, you traveled here, you saw firsthand, we've got a problem we kind of have to step back even further, even before the land management piece. But I want to get into it because I think it's so important to create motivation to get out of this, like you say, almost like militaristic pattern of horses in a stall with a walkout, with a flat, sterile paddock, with electric fence all around, and having these environments where horses don't even touch each other. The properties are sort of cookie cutter where, maybe, there's a barn here and someone goes, well, I need to build a barn. Oh, this is what my friend did. And all of a sudden we have another barn, another space looking exactly the same. And then someone moves on to that property, goes, well, I don't want to change it. And so we have this cycle of horses living, in a way that I feel is really, really challenging on a number of levels, health, but also just generally, like you say, land, like those pieces of land for me, when I look at those, they've been sacrificed to the horses. They've been like, okay, we're just covering this in as many layers of gravel or whatever is possible, and we're calling it a day. So can you tell me a little bit more about, like, how do you begin? How do you start with something like this? Mm-hmm.
First of all, we need to look at horses, what their behaviour is, what they are intrinsically. We need to know what they are, and they are a herd animal. And what's really sort of funny in a way, not funny, but ironic, is that even people who know nothing about horses say, oh yeah, horses are herd animals. They all say that. People, non-horse people and horse people alike. And yet horse owners, like you say, they get into this mindset. They might start off thinking the right way, but once they get into that peer pressure group and that comes from social media and everything and so on, before that, from their own smaller groups and so on. And then they start to forget what horses really are, and they because they're not seeing any good examples. So first of all, we've got to learn and understand and acknowledge what horses are, and then we also have to acknowledge that land, we are only custodians of that land. We're not going to be here forever. We should be looking at any land that we own or rent. You don't have to own it. Whatever, that land that you are responsible for, you should be thinking in terms of leaving that land in a far better state than what you gain it usually, because usually when you first get it, it's not so good. And you also then need to learn about what good land looks like, because we also need to change our mindset on that one as well, because we tend to think it should look like a bowling green. And now we know that it's quite the opposite. So a lot of what we teach actually involves turning what people already think completely around. And so that's why we have like this 5-hour talk that we do where people are absolutely blown away by the end of the day. But we have a short course and so on. But it's about teaching people to think completely differently about what they've ever been taught about horses and land management. And then the other thing as well is, it's learning things like about how important it is to be sustainable. Because, for instance, it's okay having all this fancy way of keeping your horses, and it costs an absolute fortune to keep them. What if you run out of money? What if you can no longer do that? And it isn't okay anyway, because it's not actually helping anything. But just say you can keep it going. But what if one day you can't? Then you've wasted so much money and time and effort going down, barking up the wrong tree, basically. Your system should be as sustainable as possible, because things are going to get harder, not easier in the future. Feed is going to become more expensive and so on. So your little bit of land, I mean, if you've only got an acre, yes, it's not going to feed your 2 or 3 horses. But if you've got 5 acres, even if it only feeds them for a few months a year, and then you have to buy in feed, to make up the shortfall, that's better than the land being on this downward spiral, and then you end up with no feed, and every single mouthful they eat has to be imported onto the property. That's not sustainable. And it doesn't have to be like that. We can turn that around. So we should be looking at what you own as how sustainable can we make this? Because you don't know what your future is going to be. You might have a good job now and lots of money coming in, but it might not always be like that, and it's silly to waste money anyway, isn't it? In fact, one of the reasons that Stuart and I have come to where we are now is because we started out with no money, and yet we managed to do quite a lot because between us, we're a good combination in that we can problem solve very well, and we managed to do an awful lot with a very small amount of money. And if we'd had a lot of money, we would have probably actually made more mistakes because we could afford to. But we've actually learned how to do things on a shoestring initially. And that has been, we didn't think it that way at the time when we had no money, but we now know that was actually a gift, that we were in that position, so determined to do what I wanted to do. And Stuart was so determined we weren't going to waste money that between us, we came up with this system of horsekeeping that saves money as well as is good for horses and so on.
Oh, I just love that. I mean, as someone who has, so Diva came into my life when I was 23 and I was just finishing university. And as you can imagine, I was so poor. And so I was like,
I'm in debt. Yes.
My heart horse has arrived.
Yeah.
How am I going to pay? I was working at every barn and I was mucking I was doing all the things, but it also, like you say, it made me really creative.
Yes, it does.
Creative, because I was like, and I realized as well, she doesn't need all the things that I think that she needs. She doesn't even necessarily, she doesn't need blankets. She doesn't need, feed in the same way. She doesn't need, all these, like the things that I regarded as, this is what it means to own a horse here, sort of all fell away. And I think it was telling you a little bit about, before, where I'd had her in Victoria for a number of years. And she basically, like, long and the short of it, she just could not deal. She was in a paddock with electric fencing, tiny paddock, couldn't move on the end of the row. So she was right on a ravine and she was terrified, beside herself. I would come out to the barn and her eyes would be rolled, whites of her eyes. I couldn't even take her out and do anything because she was dangerous. She was just not even in her body anymore. And I kid you not, I don't think I need to tell you this, because you get it. I literally moved her, and I swear within 24 hours.
Yeah.
She was a different horse. I put her in a herd on land that was, let me tell you, not fancy, right?
Yeah.
It was everything you could do to just make sure it was safe. And there was a creek, there was a forest, there was, all these things, and different horse.
I know. It's unbelievable. And and I mean, imagine when horses are living in these small electrified yards, it's like us living in a room that's got electrified walls, isn't it? It makes the area even smaller because then you've got a distance that they won't go near because they're near the fence, for instance. So it's mind-boggling, isn't it, really?
It's mind-boggling. She couldn't even trot in her paddock, and I think that's the case for many horses here. And then we wonder, okay, why are they getting injured, or why are these things happening? It's like, well, because they don't move.
The weird thing is, people have somehow come to think that turning them out in groups is more dangerous than keeping them like that. And what we always say is, obviously, turning out in groups, they can sometimes get injured. But if you actually look at how many horses have significant or even life-ending fence injuries, it's because they're very, very common. And they are nearly always from horses that are kept separately. Horses that live in groups rarely go near the fence, unless they're in a bold paddock and there's grass on the other side of the fence, which is a separate issue, and which is not a situation you shouldn't have anyway. But horses, rarely injure each other as much as fences injure horses, and yet people keep them separate because they're so worried about them getting kicked from another horse or whatever.
Oh, absolutely. So on this topic, because this is one of the biggest barriers I've seen here, shifting the way people manage land and manage horses, is this whole, people are scared out of their minds of putting horses together. And unfortunately, it's created this perpetual cycle where oftentimes a horse is weaned And then they're never in with, potentially they're in with weanlings, and then they're never in with horses again. They're sold into a working environment. That's it. And so you get horses that are under socialized that do have a harder time maybe integrating into a herd or shifting. So I would love to hear your thoughts of like, how do you work with safely integrating a herd, horses together?
I mean, the way to do it is to do it safely is to have, if you can have a setup where you've got your already established herd and then you've got your newcomer and they go into a safe spot like an arena or a fence, something with a safe fence. And they just get to know each other over the fence. Back in the old days, we used to just literally open the gate and throw them in and hope they were okay, whereas that's not a good idea. But you can, get them to know each other over the fence and then maybe put them in with one horse in an area so that they get to have a buddy and then put them in the group. But there's things like when the actual established herd, again, if they're out on good pasture and there's plenty of space and all that kind of thing, usually it's the first 5 minutes that you'll see any bit squealing and all that sort of thing, and then it's like, oh, we're hungry again, get their heads down, and they're just back to grazing. It's like they've always been together. And this is the problem as well, is it's always that first 5 minutes when owners panic, oh my goodness, look what's happening. But that's because it's all kicking off. Like you say, they're so under-socialised. It's so exciting for them. I mean, it's going to be, isn't it? It's like a child that's been kept in isolation in a cupboard, actually, in somebody's wardrobe, and suddenly you bring them out and take them to preschool. They're going to be out excited out of their mind, aren't they? So people have got, even though we shouldn't anthropomorphise about horses, we still, for some people, that is the only way they'll get it, is actually comparing. If you did that to a child, or a dog, what they would feel like, and that is, one analogy. There's lots of, if you think about them. And the beauty is once you get your horses in a herd, then you have so much opportunity then for them to start repairing the land. But it doesn't happen if you have horses all separate, because repairing the land involves rotating the horses around the land, because that's the only way that you can come anywhere close to what happens to land in the wild environment. In the wild environment, basically, you've got huge herds of animals, or you would have if they hadn't all died out, moving across the landscape, grazing as they go. And what they're doing is they're putting a high level of pressure on the land, but for a really short period of time, which is the absolute opposite of what happens in the domestic situation, where you've got one horse, one paddock. That means you've got low or high grade pressure depending on the stocking rate, but it's 100% of the time. That's the difference. If you get your horses in a herd, even if you only have 3 acres at your disposal, say, and you've got 5 horses, it's too many, but we've all got 200. We've all been, guilty of that one.
Guilty, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, and if you have the right facilities, you can manage horses on that, and I'll explain how in a minute. So that means then that those 3 acres that you have that's available can be split into 3 areas, and then you can rotate the horses around those areas. You can even subdivide them with strip grazing or whatever into even smaller areas, so that then the land then is starting to get rest and recuperation. This is land. Well, when I say land, I mean grasses. They have to have rest and recuperation. There's no such thing as a grass that can survive on 100% pressure all the time. The only grasses that come close to that are those really short grasses that you get on golf courses and things, so like your couch grasses, that type of thing. But even that, in the end, under the pressure of grazing, constant grazing, will give up. And then you end up with mud and dust, because one's at either end of the scale. Either it's too dusty all the time because it's not raining enough, or it's raining too much, and your horses are just stood in mud all the time. Mm-hmm. So what we advocate on top of this, getting your horses into a herd, is that you have an area where the horses can be removed from the land when needed and reapplied for grazing when the conditions are right. Because if you have too many horses for your acreage, which nearly every horse person does, because you would really need hundreds of acres to do it right otherwise. So, nobody's got enough land really. And so you have this area of hard standing, and that means you can remove that hoof pressure whenever you need to. And if you think about it, when horses are grazing, they're walking. Every mouthful they take, pretty much, they take a step. So they're moving. But the minute they finish, in a grazing bout, in scientific terms it's called a bout, lasts around 3 hours. The minute they finish, they walk back to the gate or wherever it is that, well, it's the gate. They walk back to the gate to where it takes them to supplementary feed or where you come with the supplementary feed.
Mm-hmm.
And they stand there, and that could be for hours and hours and hours, especially if you turn them out and go to work for the day and then come back. They will be standing in that gateway for hours, and that's why the gateways always end up muddy and weedy and boggy and the whole lot, and the horses end up with mud fever and so on. Our system involves always having that gate open for to the that they're currently grazing. So when they finish their grazing bout, you allow them to walk themselves back to a hard standing area, and you only need one hard standing area that feeds all these different areas, these different grazing areas. So you're only building one set of facilities, one shelter, one hard standing, stables if you want them, but you will find if you do this, you need them less and less.
Yep.
And they can always get themselves back to that. And you will be amazed that then the horses will spend hours just standing on this hard standing, especially if you have hay on it as well. And that's where the water is. You don't put water in the paddocks. You have it in the hard standing. So then this is what they do in the wild. They have to walk from a grazing area to a water point to another area with shade. And that's what they do as a group. They make the decision as a group. And they move around their resources. So basically the ecocentral system, which is what we developed, is what we talk about, is a mini home range, because that's what horses living in the wild, what's called a home range. And whereas in the wild it might be hundreds of square kilometres, especially in Australia or in America or whatever, in the wild, in the domestic situation it might only be 5 acres, but they can do exactly the same behaviours. They move around their home range, accessing their resources, and that is what turns those horses into relaxed horses, because suddenly they are able to behave how their behaviour is telling them they need to be. They need to do that, and it is absolutely mind-blowing what it does to them. And at the same time, they improve the land. So it's just a win-win all around, and it saves you work because they're not locked in stables all the time. You still have to manage your manure, and there's still things to do, but it's things that need doing rather than rituals that you don't need to do anyway. You know, this keep it, you know, all the hours of grooming and the sweeping of the concrete for hours. I mean, heck, you know, I've done that for thousands of hours when I was younger, and so on. You know, there's so many. You know, we can save so much time and then have more quality time to spend with our horses. You know, that way we then get to spend more time exercising them if that's what they need, and so on.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I'm very curious, because out here, one issue is a lot of horses with laminitis and metabolic disorders.
Yeah.
A lot.
Yeah.
Particularly on the island, the grasses here tend to be a little more stressed, a little more high sugar, I think. And one of the things I noticed in your work was around how to bring back grasslands, because being in a rainforest, we don't have a lot of grasslands. First of all, that's not a thing, and most of what we have is used in hay. And so a lot of barns, they're basically one big gravel slab. And there's not even an area necessarily where they can go and graze, or there's a tiny little zone that they can go out in for an hour if their owner takes them out, you know, in the summertime in very specific months, right? And so for us out here, number one, how do we, this is something I'm working with even though I'm boarding, I would love to be able to leave the land better than I found it. And I am not very sort of up on how to work. Like, even though I think I'm a pretty smart person and I'm pretty on it, I'm a gardener, this is not something we learn out here. So how do you support the grasses coming back to health? Essentially, I've got maybe a half an acre. I do a track system, so half an acre inside my inner perimeter fence. That's maybe a little bit more. That's grasslands, but it tends to, you know, if I let the horses out in there even a couple of hours a week, it tends to get packed down. It's had big drafties on it for the number of years before I was there full time.
Okay.
It needs a little TLC, I would say. So what do we do to help?
straight away, so this, whatever area you have, so in your case, it might only be half an acre or whatever, whatever area you have, chances are, as you've just described it, it's like it would be on nearly every horse property. It's already behind the 8 ball. It's already struggling and so on.
Yep.
So initially, you have to allow that area to get in front of the horses, where at the moment it's been behind the horses for many, many years. That's the thing. So initially, when you start to take care of your land, you might have to do things that involve not letting them out on the land even as often as you did before. You've got to take a step back before you can take a step forward. So as long as the conditions are going to be right, as in you're going to get some sunshine and rain, it's incredible how quickly land can regenerate, but it has to be given a break.
Yep.
It also needs grazing, but at the right time. So what we have to do as horse owners, first of all, is get our head around how, instead of the grass being, only a centimetre long, and I have to keep turning my horses out because they have to go out on that, we take a step back, let the grasses grow much longer, let them regenerate, weeds and everything initially, because the land has to repair itself. And then when you let the horses out, still only let them out for short bursts, because that's all you can do when you've got such a small area of land. Like in that situation, your horses might only get one short grazing bout a day, but that is better than rather than them going out on stressed grass. The fact that they're going out onto longer fibrous grass is great. That's fine. And one a day is fine if the rest of the time they're on an open area. Like you said, you have a track, or it can just be a massive yard, or it can be an arena. You then take the horses off when you want to ride on it and all that sort of thing. Everybody has different situations. But you've got to let the grass get in front of the horses. And you do that by resting it initially. But grass thrives on being grazed, but not on being overgrazed. So you should really be thinking in terms of allowing the horses onto grass when it's around about 15 centimetres. What would that be? Yeah, quite long.
Mm-hmm.
And don't you ever graze down to about 5 centimetres. And then in that system you're talking about, you probably wouldn't even necessarily have enough area for rotational grazing. But even then, in half an acre, you could still petition it into grazing cells, to be honest, because your horses in that situation would actually be getting their exercise from the track itself.
Totally.
So you wouldn't even be turning them in the paddock for exercise, you're turning them out to graze. So in that case, it could be quite small cells, and you move them around those cells, so each area then gets even longer to rest and recuperate. So that would work really well in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Then, as horse owners as well, we have to get our head around thinking that really short grass is safe and really long grass isn't.
Yes.
And the thing is, initially, when you turn horses that have only ever been allowed to graze really short grass, when you initially turn them out onto longer grass, sometimes they can gorge themselves. So you wouldn't just turn them out for 24 hours and go, look, here you go, get on with it, because that's when you might get laminitis. However, that long piece of grass, a high percentage of it is fibre anyway. They have to eat quite a lot of it. But again, it's still not a good idea to do that. So you need to do it very gradually. But when the horses realise that they're going to be getting more of a mouthful of grass, they start to relax a bit more.
Yep.
That kind of thing. So and what we typically, and there are some horses who are so metabolically damaged that any amount of grass isn't good for them. Although saying that, we've had lots of success with people in our group who eventually have managed to turn them around. Because, for instance, we talk about, instead of, for instance, thinking that you turn your horses out in summer and you keep them in all winter, you could do it another way around. You could actually keep them off the land in summer when you've got more time for riding and doing, exercise. If you've got this outdoor area as you have, I'm not talking about putting them in stables, I'm talking about having them on surfaced area. Horses go along in summer and then graze them on that in the winter. It doesn't have to be the way that we traditionally think of keeping horses in all winter and out all summer. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be the other way around, because when you let horses out on longer grass, the land itself is far more protected, because that hoof is not creating as much damage, because it's got all that organic matter there. So you can actually then turn your horses out more in winter. And I know in Canada, in frostier parts, you can turn them out when it's frosty anyway. Well, not just frosty. I mean when it's frozen, when it's snow and all that kind of thing. So once you start to allow the grasses to go longer, they protect the land for much longer anyway, and then you can actually have more turnout time further down the track. So you might be holding your horses a bit more than you'd like initially, but once the land has repaired itself, people often actually with our system end up with too much land.
Yep.
And then what's good is they can start to get a few different animals in. I know you wouldn't in your situation because you really have a small space.
Yep.
Then you can get a couple of sheep and a cow or whatever, a couple of cows, like just like horses. They need their own type, their own species. And then you can start to get rotational grazing going with different animals, which then your land will improve even more. And you'll hardly have any worms, for instance, because they kill out each other's worms. There's so many benefits once you can start doing that. But that's further down the track. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Awesome. I love this, though. It's got my wheels turning. And I would love to know, so with my pretty sad little pasture, what are some of the steps that you take to bring that back? Like, would I be using some of my horse manure and spreading it? I read on your website about mulching, which of course I do a ton of here. Yep. And it mulches in part itself. We've got a big chestnut tree that drops all its leaves and I just leave them all. And, so there's a bit of that going on, but just wondering how do we support this growing back? And also I noticed as well, like you saying, you can put out sort of maybe old hay or different things as mulch. And then that's actually providing some free grass seeds, some different species possibilities. So
So and again, this is the beauty of actually only having a small area as you have. It actually is really easy to regenerate that land because it's only a small area. If you think in terms of a farmer who might have, especially in Canada, might have hundreds or thousands of acres to manage, they might want to do the right thing, but doing it is very expensive, very difficult for them. Whereas horse owners, the beauty with horse owners is that they usually only have a few acres at the most to regenerate. So it actually becomes really easy once they know how. So things are, so when it's not muddy and wet, for instance, you could feed hay on the grassy area initially while you're trying to regenerate it. So you could have a little bit leading onto the bit of the cell which you're currently regenerating, feed your hay on there. Then what they do is they trample all that hay into the ground, they trample the seeds that are in it, and then you take them off that cell and give it a chance to break down and regenerate. And when those plants get growing, this is another issue to get your head around. When grass plants are really short, the bit you see above ground is mirrored underground, meaning their root system, if that plant gets to live beyond 1 inch tall, that means the root system is never longer than 1 inch long either because they're the same length as each other. When you start to let plants grow tall, that means their roots also grow to the same length underground. And then when it gets grazed, the roots die back into the soil, so you're creating organic matter. That's why grasslands capture so much carbon when they're healthy. They're massively capturing carbon and storing it in the soil. And so this cycle of grazing, cutting the plants back, the plants die back because they've been grazed, the roots die back rather. And then it happens again, the plant grows again, more organic matter in the soil. That organic matter, whilst it's growing, is opening up and decompacting your soil. Okay. Whereas that will never happen with short plants. It only happens with longer plants. And that's why this is another issue to get your head around a little bit, is this subject of weeds. People see weeds and panic. And yes, there are some weeds you don't want, definitely, and every country's got different ones. But a lot of the time, weeds are actually good because they have rapidly growing taproots that grow really quickly down into the soil. So when you see a weed shoot up in the air and it ends up like 3 feet high, that means there's a taproot that long going down into your soil, opening the soil up. And the weeds that appear are usually the ones that Mother Nature's decided need to be there. Mm-hmm. So we need to rethink weeds as well. And I'm not saying we should allow our fields to become covered in ragwort and all that sort of thing, but we do need to rethink weeds because most of the time they are actually just a transitional stage before better grasses come, more edible grasses or whatever. Mm. They're actually doing the job, they're improving the soil. So mulch is really good, composting your manure and putting that out. But obviously when you have a lot of horses in a really small grassland area, you might only need to use some of that manure. You don't want tons and tons of manure sitting on the soil, not getting into the soil. But again, as the grasses start to regenerate, they'll use more of that composted manure. They'll actually be able to use it. When you put it on bare soil, initially you don't need too much, but then as the plants start to grow, they can use more and more of it. And this is also, and composted manure, you can swap it with people who have cows, for instance. So you can get some cow manure on there as well.
Yep.
We think in terms of nothing organic will ever leave this property again. So anything that's organic, that doesn't mean organic as in, that just means anything that has ever lived needs to stay on that land. So, so it needs to be composted or whatever. So obviously you'll already be doing this anyway, but everything from the house that can be thrown on the compost heap, everything goes on that land, anything, even grass cuttings, as long as you don't let the horses get near them. So if you've got a lawn, even that is fantastic for regenerating, for creating organic matter. You just make sure you don't let the horses near it. But it very quickly breaks down, and becomes more organic matter. So it's an area the size of yours is very quick, is very easy to regenerate. And in our group, we've got lots and lots of people who've done that with mulching in really dry conditions in Australia.
I saw some of those photos and I was like, wow,
yeah. And previously people used to scrape it off and get rid of it, thinking it was bad stuff. And this, it's actually wonderful stuff is mulch, and it breaks down so rapidly. And again, your horses, by eating the round bales and then, in inverted commas, wasting some of it, it's that waste that you actually want. It's mixed with their manure, and that is creating topsoil. We had a paddock in Australia that was just rock, and it ended up with several inches of topsoil on it after years of mulching on it and horses grazing and being fed round bales on there. We went through an 18-month drought, and by the end of it, it just sprang back. It was amazing. And again, this is what, if horse owners start to learn this stuff, they can actually become an asset rather than a liability for the world in general. Basically, horse people haven't cottoned onto this yet, because they probably, a lot of horse people actually get gentle or not so gentle ribbing by their family or community or whatever. Oh, horses, what a waste.
Yep.
Kind of.
Yeah.
But if they actually cotton onto this, they can turn this around. They're actually providing a benefit to the environment if they do it right. Horses can either be really bad for the land, but they can very easily be very good for the land. And that's how they do it, is by growing longer grasses, and then that's naturally providing land for wildlife. You're recreating biodiversity, and that's what they're doing with these rewilding programs. That's why they use ponies alongside cattle. The combination of ponies and cattle together are particularly good. And they're turning huge areas in Europe, even here in the UK, back into rewilded land, back into biodiverse pasture. And it is absolutely fascinating to see. It's wonderful.
Oh, this is so exciting for me. I told you before we started that we moved onto a piece of land that was for 5 years cultivated to become a habitat space for our native plants and animals here. Mm-hmm. So we've got mason bees and amazing birds and all these incredible, we've got piles of wildlife, wildlife hiding spaces. We've got literally a snake pile at the back of big rocks and things. And so, I'm so on board with this. In my paddock, a tree will fall down, and I'll say to the property owner, just cut enough for the girls to get by, and the rest just leave there. Because I want them, and they go over right away. They're eating the bark, they're eating the root system, they're getting these into their system, and then those logs or whatever are breaking down. So I could totally even, it's so funny when you kind of follow your instinct, because I had one area where, okay, there's a bunch of branches that have come down as sort of a rock pile, and I've been just piling manure on top of it and kind of letting it be a little fixture.
Yes.
But then when I read your stuff, I was like, this is providing homes for creatures and organisms. And there's just this sense of, okay, we can actually by small steps do these pieces. And what I'm hearing as well is the dollar symbols. So when you're talking about, what was the piece here about manure? There are many, many barns here where manure has to be shipped out.
Yes, I know.
They're having to hire trucking companies to come and take their manure off the property.
I know, it's bonkers. It's just crazy, isn't it? And It's a, they just need to turn around what they do with it. And another really exciting thing to look at, and there's a video on our website about dung beetles. I don't know what the situation is in Canada. I haven't looked, but I'm pretty sure there would be, some pretty good dung beetles already there. But again, when you look after dung beetles, they do all the work for you. You don't have to go around picking it up and all that sort of thing. I mean, in a really small area, you might have to do. But on decent-sized paddocks, they do all the work, and they actually vastly improve your soil, and you don't have to worm your horses anymore, or much, much less. Yep. There's just so many benefits, and they are the world's experts at dung management. But in typical human fashion, we think we know better, don't we? And we're just learning now, aren't we, I think, as a culture. We're starting to realise that maybe we didn't have all the answers and so on, because we've so many mistakes. Nature already has it all worked out. So we always have to look to nature for that solution and see if we can fit that in the domestic situation. That's what we did with the equicentral system. Yeah. Looked at that, and then along the way just learned so much more as well that we've added to it. And it started out really just being to save time and energy, and it's ended up being much, much more than that. It's been all about, so much more. It's just really exciting. But even in the smallest place, and so going back to that point you were talking about where people buy these barns and it's already stables, it's already that and the other. That happens here in the UK a lot. It happens in Australia. It happens everywhere. But there's often a lot of things you can do even in that situation. So, for instance, if you have traditional stables already built, it might need, obviously it'll usually need a bit of changing around, but you might be able to take some of the walls out and turn them into what we call running sheds. Lots of people have done that. That's quite an inexpensive thing to do because you're taking something out usually rather than putting it in. And then, so you then have these running sheds. If you've already got lots of hard standing, because a lot of horse properties, that's something they usually already have, but they're not using it properly, or what we'd call properly. They have lots of hard standing around the building, but they just lead the horses backwards and forwards across it. Yep. Whereas in our system, the horses would be allowed free access to that area. Yep. And free access to if you've got stables, then you adapt them, turn them into running sheds. And the horses then have got shade and shelter, which they need and want, but they can access it when they want because the doors are open. You give them lots of space to get in and out. And we've got loads of people who've done this. So they've the building, the build. So what I'm saying is, even just because you've got this really expensive building that the horses really don't want, you can turn it into something that they will actually love and will access many times a day because they want to get away from the insects. They want to get out of the heat. Some horses don't mind being in the rain, but others really don't like it, and so on. So there's still lots you can do with that building. It just needs a bit more. It just needs some adaptation. And if you already have hard standing, then you're already more than halfway there because you've now got a means of keeping that hoof pressure off the land when it's either too wet and too dry. And as I always say to people, think about it. Most of the time, the land is either too wet or too dry. It's rarely just right. So you're always having to manage how much pressure they put on the land. So instead of in a traditional system, we might go, right, we turn them out at 8 o'clock and we bring them back in at 6 o'clock in the evening and that's it. And that happens from the 1st of May until, October, and then they're in hot winter. We have to turn that on its head because there'll be times in winter when the land is fine for them to go out on. Or not, and the same in summer. We need to adjust that. And once we have that hard standing with the hay set up in it, a hay station or 2 or 3, and the water, and they're allowed to come and go as they please. When it's really wet, you just shut the grazing cell off, but you still allow them access to the rest of the area. There's no stress. They're quite happy doing that because that's what they do in the wild, move around to access their resources.
Yeah. I love that. I think that there's, what I've been sort of wrangling around in my brain is, okay, what are the steps with the current scenarios here that people can take? Because a lot of people, they have this, okay, I already have the barn, everything. I was very inspired by a girlfriend of mine. So she leases on a property, which has a big barn. I think about 6 stalls or so. Yeah. And like you say, she's taken all the middle, like all the dividers out, and she's used the hallway as a part of the loafing area. So there's no corners, and the horses always have a way to move out and move.
There's a way. Perfect.
And there, she puts loads of shavings in there for everybody to have a lie down, and they love it. I mean, it's like a very popular zone. And it's so neat to see a barn that would have been used very traditionally with a stall in and out, paddock being utilized in this way, where now she has, I think 6 horses there, and they're able to move in and out of this barn and out into the rest of their track system. Incredible.
Because in domestic situation, we control, and if you think about some competition horses, we control every single step they take. Again, this is turning it completely on its head to a point where the horses control what they do, what they get to make their own decisions. And imagine what that does for their well-being, just being able to, you know what, we'll go out and we'll go and have a graze, even though it's raining a bit, we've decided we'll go out, or it's getting cold, let's go in and let's get out of the rain. They can make these decisions. Normally horses never get to make any of these kind of decisions, and that for their mental well-being is enormous, absolutely enormous. It's such a huge factor. And so we're allowing them to do that, and it's amazing how many people write to us and say, my horse has just become a completely different animal, so chilled out and so relaxed and so on, because they're suddenly now able to live as they would in the wild pretty much. It's just on a smaller scale. And even in the wild, the size of that home range varies totally on the availability of resources. So here in the UK, where we actually have ponies living wild in the south of the UK, for various places, but just say the New Forest in the UK, their home range is not hundreds of square miles. It's large, but it's not massive, and that's because their resources are much more abundant. There's loads of water, there's plenty of grass, and so on. So their home range is not that big by choice. They're not restricted. It just that's all they need. Whereas if you go to the outback of Australia or America, their home range is hundreds of square miles, because it has to be, because they have to travel that far, get to grass, and then trek all the way back to the waterhole. So the fact that we're keeping them in a small area and the home range is really small doesn't stress them, because in the wild, if their resources were so available, that's all they would move anyway. Maybe a little bit more if it's a tiny property, but it wouldn't be much more. Because horses don't, when you turn horses out in a paddock, if they're full, just say you've given them a meal and you turn them out, or if you turn them out, for instance, on an arena, there's nothing to eat, say, but they're not hungry or whatever. They don't say to themselves, I'm going to run around for the next half hour because I need to get fit. I've got a competition on the weekend. They might run around for the first 5 minutes until that initial burst of energy that comes from being locked up, if they're kept in that traditional system, until that's burnt off. The second that's burnt off, they switch to just standing there. And they just stand for hours until somebody comes and gets them. That's if their needs are met in terms of food, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They're hungry and you turn them out in a paddock, they will graze, but the minute they've finished grazing and the minute their stomach tells them they've eaten enough fibre, which is what tells them to stop grazing, they then stand still. So what we're doing with this system is removing all that standing still behaviour to, instead of being on your precious land, their precious land, onto hard standing. That's one of the big factors, and that's where then you start to see the land repair itself so much quicker, because you're not getting all that hoof action from horses just standing around.
Yeah. So one of the other things I've seen out here, which I would love your opinion on, is around feeding hay or forage and access to hay or forage. So what I've seen over the years, and thank goodness it is seeming to be shifting, is that, okay, horses get 4 feeds a day and that's it. And a lot of them are standing around with nothing to eat for hours and hours and hours a day. Say it takes them, half an hour, 45 minutes to get through that flake or 2, and they're standing for the rest. And that the development of stress behavior,
risk of colic,
ulcers, cribbing, weaving, all these stress behaviors is, what I see is like in part that they don't have access to enough fiber and forage.
The reason I think that's come around, partly one of the reasons that's come around, is same in other parts of our life, peer pressure and advertising and so on pushes people to think that they're better off, and people do it with dogs as well, better off feeding something with a brand name on it.
Yep.
And the hay goes by the wayside, when it should actually be the other way around. The hay is the most important component of the diet, or the fibre or the grass,
Yep.
or whatever, the actual fibre. And supplementary feed, it still might be important in many cases, but it should be as little as you can get away with. It should be just a small part of the diet. It should just be what's necessary. But the trouble is, because, and I'm not knocking all feed companies, because, without them, our horses, wouldn't be able to compete and so on. But they're not going to push that your horse needs hay, because they don't sell hay. They sell hard feed, or whatever you call it. In Canada, we call it hard feed here, meaning concentrate they're generally speaking, and some are not, some do, but generally speaking, a lot of them wouldn't say, well, actually, you don't need this feed in a bag. You actually just need to feed it hay, because, for instance, it might be a 20-year-old pony that's not getting any work anyway, and so it doesn't need anything in a bag. It might need some supplements, but it doesn't need concentrate feed, in that situation. But you're not going to hear that very often, because this is the world, the world revolves on money and marketing and all that kind of thing, doesn't it? So we have to try and read between the lines all the time, because now, much more so than when I was a kid, when this stuff wasn't even that available, now it's big money. A horse owner can make a feed company a lot of money. So, like, for instance, a cow is just as big, but they're not going to make as much money out of that, of selling to a farmer, because a farmer has to make a profit. Yep. A horse owner generally has more disposable income, or is prepared, a lot of them don't have that much money, but they're prepared to spend more money on that animal. So there's a lot of money to be made on horse people. So we have to try and be skeptical, if you like, a lot of the time, about whether our horse really needs this, because often it doesn't. We need to be really careful about what we feed them, and make sure that what we're feeding them is really high fibre. And that fibre that we buy, it needs to be the lowest, usually, because I'm talking about most horses don't do enough work. Usually, for most horses, it needs to be the lowest energy hay you can find, so that they can eat more of it. Whereas if you find really good quality hay, then they're not going to be able to eat as much of it without getting too fat. And again, it's not even just actually modern marketing pressure. It also goes back to, just say, 200 years ago, when horses really did work for a living. They needed ryegrass hay and clover hay. Because they spent 10 hours a day working. So when they were in the stable, they also needed that stable. They only had a few hours to rest and recuperate, so they could go out and do it up again next day. So that feed they were being fed needed to be oats and, ryegrass hay and clover. But now we still get that same information that horses need all that, whereas horses are rarely doing enough work in, whatever, and exercise. They rarely get enough exercise. So they need to be on low energy feed, but good, but biodiverse and high fibre.
I love it. Yeah, that sense. I have for years, but I often mix my hay. I would put it out because I figure, I like variety. But I found that that's worked really well for my girls. Like, sometimes we'll mix 3 types of hay and put it out. And and keep it, like you say, low energy. My girls don't do a lot, so it's like, as low sugar as possible. And
Again, and haymakers will respond to this. In Australia, where we've been doing this a lot longer, there's a lot of haymakers now who make hay for horses, and where it used to be high energy, now they realise that they can actually make more money by making hay that costs less to make.
Totally. Yeah. They've been figuring it out here too, which is great.
Yeah. It's less fertilizer on it, if any, and so on. Just let the native grasses grow, and that's worth a fortune now, where in the old days that used to be regarded as rubbish, but now it's actually regarded as really good stuff by horse owners once they become educated and start looking for that stuff. So that turns that around as well. So many things get turned on the head. What goes around comes around, doesn't it, as well?
Isn't it the truth? Isn't it the truth? Well, I don't know how it's been an hour, Jane, but we're coming to the end of our time together. And this has just been such a pleasure. And I've learned so much from you. And I'm really appreciative of the work you're doing in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And yeah, you're welcome to come in the group. And and if people have a look on our website, they'll see all sorts of little videos and our little free video course, which will get them started. So they're more than welcome to join in. We've got lots of people in Canada already who follow our way. And we did do a talk there quite a few years ago, but that was about 12 years ago, actually.
Amazing. So what is your website, Jane?
It's equiculture.net. So equi as in horse, culture, all one word, .net.
Wonderful. And I went on there, and Jane has a wonderful little mini course that's free. So you can go on there and just sign up, which is amazing. And it looks like you've got another kind of bigger course as well for people that are wanting to really pursue this.
And we've got the books as well. I mean, if people don't want to do the whole course, they can buy the PDF. The cheapest way to do it is just buy the PDF of the books. You know, talking about cheapest chips, buy a PDF of the books if that's what you prefer to read, and just learn it all that way. So, you know, it's just that if you're on the course, you can join the group and there's much more interaction. But it's horses for courses. Everybody likes different ways of learning. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, everybody, I hope you check this out and, you know, learn more about this piece. I would love to see us here in North America catching up to things a little bit more with the way that we're keeping horses. And yeah, I know I'm going to be out there mulching and doing things with my grass. Really excited to start that process. Yeah.
Great. Send us some pictures. Great.
I will. Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jane. Yeah, great. And thank you everybody for listening in today. I hope you learned something like me, and we'll look forward to seeing you again down the road for more podcast episodes. Bye for now.
Thanks so much for listening in today. If you're interested in learning more about equine cranial therapy from Elise and I, we now have an introductory webinar available, and you can sign up for that at bit.ly /CST webinar. So that's bit.ly /CST webinar to get that really cool replay and be signed up for our live Q&A. In that, you get 2 amazing techniques as well to start your journey in cranial therapy. And if you are interested in learning more about our certification, you can head to equilibriatherapeutics.com /equine-craniosacral. So we hope to see you there. You can apply today. Our intake begins January the 1st, but you can apply anytime, and this intake closes January 31st. Okay, have a great day.